Hello and welcome to Catholic Unscripted. I'm Catherine Bennett.
I'm Mark Lambert.
I'm Gavin Ashenden.
Well, a week today, Britons will be going to the booths to cast their vote for the next Prime Minister in the general election. And there's lots of TV shows with debates going on and interviews in newspapers and commentaries here and there. And there's one that we picked up on in the Telegraph. And Timothy Stanley, who's a Catholic, has interviewed the gregarious and very controversial George Galloway. And in it, George Galloway was very George Galloway. There's some excellent lines in there. I think someone came to shake his hand and said, "I better not shake your hand because I've just eaten fish and chips and my hands are all dirty." And he said, "Don't worry, I've just been with Piers Morgan. My hands are also dirty." But that's very George Galloway. He's very quick-witted. Well, in this conversation that was mostly about politics, he then turned it to religion and said there had been rumours that George Galloway had converted to Islam, and Galloway says, "No, I'm a faithful Catholic. My mum goes to mass every week, and he's also a mass goer, and which is quite something these days, just to attend mass if you say you're a Catholic." And he goes further and says, I'm a fan of the Latin mass. He says it's poetry in motion, which was quite beautiful. And Timothy Stanley asks him, have you told the Pope Francis, about your love of the Latin mass? And he said, yes, I have. So we'll see what comes of that. But it was quite a surprise. I think I did know that George Galloway was Catholic by birth. I wasn't sure on his how regularly he practices. But it was an interesting comment from a very, very interesting man, wasn't it, Gavin?
Whenever I prepare to listen to George Galloway say anything, I get the same kind of excitement as I do before a rugby match starts. This is going to be violent, skillful, quite bloody, and who knows what the outcome's going to be. He's one of the cleverest men in the country and one of the most effective politicians. He clearly has a love for the truth and a respect for principle. And yet, it's very difficult to know what his principles are, because it was only a few months ago that he was defying everybody and had a program on Russia Today, which normally gets you cancelled from everything. And suddenly he pops up, and now he's Islam's best friend constitutionally, and the Muslims are voting him into parliament. He's anti-Israel, and suddenly, wonderful Tim Stanley, who's got a great sense of humour, is very alert, throws him a series of questions. How Catholic are you? And then he replied the way you did, Catherine. I think it's going to be very exciting that George Galloway is going to be in Parliament as a practicing Catholic, because up until now we've had Jacob Rees-Mogg, and Jacob Rees-Mogg, while very charming, he's a bit rich, he's a bit of a toff, and he's not exactly the example of everyone's universal Catholic. So I think to have Rees-Mogg on one side and George Galloway on the other is going to make life very interesting. But I keep on thinking that the Galloway is going to launch a kind of an Exocet missile for truth. You just don't know which target he's aimed at. And so I'm very glad he's there. And I hope he becomes more Catholic, not less, as he gets his hands dirty with the political process in Westminster.
Yeah, there's some great lines in here. Galloway talks about when he first entered Parliament, and he said there were scores of people who, when they stood up, you didn't quite know what they were going to say, but you knew you wanted to hear it. And then he criticises the current state of politicians and says Rishi Sunak is retiring from, or actually, I shouldn't say that. That's assuming he's lost the election. Rishi Sunak, if he loses the election, will be standing down as Prime Minister before the age of 40, which is quite something to comprehend, that he's already been Prime Minister. And so he talks about the change in politicians since he's been in politics, and also talks about his own background, not in academia, but working in the factories. And one thing that came up in the conversation, Mark, was Catholic social teaching. So Tim Stanley said, I assume you're a fan of Catholic social teaching? And he said, yes, he is. Well, Catholic social teaching, you can see here the 7 principles, which I'll just bring up on the screen now. And Mark, Catholic social teaching is open to a lot of interpretation, and there's not always agreement between people about how this should be implemented, is there?
Oh, didn't I? I thought there was. I thought it was pretty clear cut, and I really like it. I think it's a really good thing. But perhaps you're alluding to the disparity between sort of like it tends to be a more lefty, social injustice-y sort of Catholic thing, doesn't it?
I think you can interpret them and understand them and implement them in different ways. And so in that sense, I think there might be disagreement about how to best implement them rather than disagreement over whether they're any good or not.
Well, I think that's a disagreement based on putting your political allegiance before the gospel. And if you look at it with the eyes of the gospel, then I always think from a political point of view that I'm a Catholic first, and then what the party best espouses those values that I like. Subsidiarity, for example, is a really good example.
Yeah.
But I think it's really Catholic social teaching is an absolute gem. It's a brilliant thing to have, and it's what I always go to whenever I'm concerned about a particular topic. But I think that when I was growing up as a cradle Catholic, I think it's got a sort of connotations of socialism, and I think that's because there was a thing where there was obviously a lot of immigrants and a lot of manual workers. And I can remember very political homilies when I was a child, which were largely sort of left-leaning. And so if it did get mixed up, Catholic social teaching, it was with the idea that, socialism, collectivism is a good thing. But that would be a spurious claim. It wouldn't be an accurate claim because Catholic social teaching completely contradicts that and condemns collectivism of any kind, and particularly Marxism and socialism.
I think you've said it exactly, expressed it in the right way. And what I was alluding to is that when Catholic social teaching might be used to serve politics, that's when it can be abused, I think. Whereas when it's gospel centered, then it is, as you say, it's actually a very, very good balance. So using our faith to help us to make political decisions first, rather than being secure in your political ideology and then trying to fit in or crowbar some kind of Catholic teaching around that, which is unfortunately what we've seen happen in us, children of the 70s and 80s, especially, Mark. I think we've been witness to that. Sorry, Gavin.
I was going to say that George Galloway very deftly and very cleverly did exactly what you're suspicious of, Katherine. Rightly suspicious, I think. He talked about falling in love with Jesus. So that was really nice and exciting to hear. How often do you hear a politician say, I've fallen in love with Jesus? But his Jesus was Jesus the Nazarene, the carpenter, the working man. And he then used, if you like, that popular view of Jesus to strike all the notes that socialism does strike. So I think that the relationship between the justice and peace movement and the Catholic Church is that Mark's plumb right, of course. There's nothing wrong with it at all. But it's when it gets detached from the supernatural, when it gets detached from the metaphysical, it becomes politics before the spiritual. That's when it begins to get distorted. And so if you run the whole justice and peace and the Catholic social justice agenda alongside a very keen and alert metaphysical view, then it works. But we didn't hear Galloway saying, I love Jesus the Nazarene, and by the way, I can't stand abortion. He kept off the whole sanctity of the human being thing and kept on the left-wing political truisms, which work if they are kept allied to the metaphysical, which he didn't do. So I think that's one of the reasons why Catherine's got a red light flashing and Mark's got a green light flashing. And the answer is it depends on whether they're linked together in the right way.
Yeah, we don't know, of course, what George Galloway's views. I mean, maybe we do, but I haven't heard them on abortion and euthanasia and life issues. But that's the point. If we say Catholic social teaching has these 7 principles, we can't cherry pick and say, well, I want these ones, but not these ones. He did say that he surprises some people by saying he's against mass immigration. He says, I do believe that everyone here needs to be treated equally, but I also don't think that millions should come into the country. So he's not talking about borderless, society. So it was just an interesting article, I thought, that gave us a little a deeper window into Galloway. But he's such a mystery, I find, having followed him for a number of years, that the little nugget you might get today is only sort of scratching the surface. Who knows really the depth of his faith and politics?
Yeah, I can't wait till he starts talking. Once he gets hold of whoever the prime minister is in Parliament, it's going to be very exciting. And if at any point he begins to talk about the way in which Catholic social teaching requires you to reconsider the way abortion is practiced and euthanasia and gender not fertilization, the opposite, gender surgery, then it's going to he'll be he's one of the most powerful mouthpieces in the country. I hope that he really does begin to express the Catholic faith.
I've got a feeling he might, and I think Mark's just pulling up how George Galloway voted there. I don't know if that tells us anything about the life issues, but
he's never voted on fewer obstacles for access to abortion. Is all it says there. I did have a little look on Right to Life. So it looks like he might be voting in a Catholic pro-life way there.
Well,
it'll be exciting.
Which is good news.
That is good news. Well,
I think it's like, I was just going to say, I think that we see those allegiances too often in the bishops' conference. We've got a bishop in Westminster for migrants now, and all it is just about, let's not have any borders. And church teaching is nuanced, and it contains both. We've talked about it before, haven't we? But you see from the bishops, unfortunately, this is what feeds this narrative, I think, that Catherine's talking about, is that they've just got very left-wing sort of ideas, and it's blatant, it's not, and it's not reasoned. It's just lefties.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. It's, if you just take something in isolation and say, I'm desperately worried about the environment and I'm desperately sorry for migrants, and then that's wonderful and that's true, and that is Catholic social teaching to have those concerns. But those concerns always have to be balanced with the consequences of the choices we make and how they impact. So it's a much more nuanced and much fuller position that needs to be taken. And the problem is we all too often don't see or hear that nuance. We just hear the same rhetoric of, recycling guys and care for the migrants. And
the climate change is a perfect example, isn't it? It's that kind of liberation theology that says we can create heaven here on earth right now. And as Gavin exactly just said, the epistemology is that it destroys the metaphysical dimension to the faith. So, and then people get lost because they don't understand the metaphysical dimension to the faith anymore. And that's what the bishops are doing by pushing these, these sort of, look, you can fix it ideas,
Yeah.
Which
bring about
this liberation theology, sort of Marxist, quasi-Marxist sort of ideas that are bleeding into church teaching, and they're not in the doctrine, they're not in Catholic social teaching. And it's like it makes me wonder, do they not understand it, the bishops, or are they being deliberately obtuse? Are they deliberately trying to just push us in a particular direction? Like when Vincent Nichols has been putting out little videos about voting, hasn't he? He doesn't talk about anything else. That's what always amazes me. We've got people, euthanasia and all kinds of stuff going on. He never puts out a video about that, but he puts out a video about the election. It's sort of like, wink, wink, vote Labour. He might as well. It's like he comes and says, let's think about the things that are important to us. He might as well have vote Labour across his forehead.
You'd think the bishops of all people, though, would not look elsewhere outside of the church for answers to these problems. We're seeing it in Catholic schools, and we see Catholic schools reaching for things like United Nations Respect Awards and Respecting Diversity Awards and awards from Stonewall and awards from the UN. And you think, well, they're couched in very nice terms. Isn't this wonderful? We're going to be good global citizens. But you think, surely you can raise young Catholic young children in Catholic schools to love, to serve, to be selfless, to sacrifice, but through the teachings of the church, through the rich tradition and teachings of our faith, and not have to bring in these other things to anchor what we're trying to inculcate in them. But then if the school leaders are seeing the bishops doing it, well, then they feel, well, we're going to do it. And I feel it lets down Catholic parents who say, actually, we want our child to respect others, to love others, to make sacrifices for others, to be stewards of the earth. We want that. But we want that because we know it's right and our faith teaches it. We don't want to do it or tell them that they should do it because the United Nations happens to have drawn up a charter that they have to tick. So it has to start with the bishops, I think, who should direct the schools in the faith. Gavin?
Well, my two heroes this week are George Galloway and Bishop Patrick McKinney. Of all the people we've been speaking to, how many bishops have gone to the Pope and said, Holy Father, the Latin Mass is poetry in motion. Don't touch it. Leave it alone. Well, George Galloway did, and I suspect not many bishops did. But I want to give credit to Bishop Patrick McKinney of Nottingham, because whilst you say, Katherine, we've had our attention drawn to primary schools who are looking to the UN to teach Catholic children about globalism and mutual respect, as if there's nothing in the Gospels or the church tradition that would help them do that, including the parable of the Good Samaritan. Bishop Patrick McKinney did something very unusual, because Pride, as we know, is celebrated all over in all schools. But he directed the Catholic schools in his diocese that the children were not obliged to celebrate Pride. And this absolutely infuriated the leftists. So the first thing that happened was a group of people from the National Educational Union picketed the diocesan offices, and they were outraged. And they trotted out all this lame, old, untrue stuff, which is that gay people are marginalized and victimized and bullied, and it's, this is what Bishop McKinney was doing, was increasing the possibility of bullying, and there was a great problem of who on earth would transgender adolescents talk to, because teachers were too scared to listen to them. And all this was just untrue. You can't get any more social credit as a teenager today than saying I'm non-binary or I'm trans. So far from being bullied, you go right to the top of the kudos queue. And the people who are being bullied are actually Christian parents who want their children taught Christian sexual ethics and not being sexualized. So I think it's really marvelous that at least one bishop has said to his diocese, liberate our children from bowing down to the pride flag. If they want to do it in their own private time, or as a matter of family conviction, they can do whatever they like. But as a Catholic school, as a Catholic community, we don't do that kind of thing. He got into trouble for it, and I think I think he deserves our respect and our admiration.
Yeah, it's really letting children down, and parents, isn't it? Because they need to understand why these things are important. And of course, the whole idea of human rights comes from an idea of the human person having dignity and having sanctity. And the problem with the UN is that those natural rights, as it began, are now expanding and expanding and expanding into things like the right to IVF or the right to abortion or the right to euthanasia as examples. Now, these are not rights, but the children who've been told the reason you do this is because the UN says so will then say, well, the UN also says this. So it's letting our young children down if we don't say to them, no, the reason these things matter is because they're right, and because God tells us that these things are right and that these things aren't. And so if we only feed those kind of things to them, when they get older, they're going to say, well, this is the basis of my morality, the stuff I've been taught in school. And that was Stonewall, diversity programs, no outsiders, UN. And meanwhile, the school get a big tick from Ofsted and get outstanding because they're jumping on all these bandwagons. Well, I would rather a school that said no to those. I mean, you hear of these Jewish families who are sending their kids to schools that failed Ofsted exams. They're choosing them. Why? Because they know that the schools that are getting outstanding in Ofsted and getting big ticks are the ones that have gone along with these programs. So they're wise to it.
I think I think one of the things about it is that the arguments are not being exposed, and I think they're great points that you said. I've got a couple of things going through my head. One is that really it's just Genesis 3, isn't it? It's just the fall, and making our own subjective morality. That's what this is. And exactly as you say, when we start to manufacture a morality, you can see that the idea of rights and dignity is based on Christian morality, and then it spreads out and starts to encompass, why not this, why not that? And that is where it gets subjective, when it's divorced from the objective, from God. And I think that's so. But then the problem that we've got is that our bishops, whoever, I mean, the priests, I don't want to put more on our priests, they've got enough to do, but I kind of feel like whoever it is then, whoever's responsible for, we've got Catholic schools, right? There's got to be a Catholic somewhere who's responsible for them. Let's just put it like that. And they're not engaging with these arguments, and we need to engage with these arguments. So, for example, the argument about teaching, for example, LGBT issues to small children would be that there are some of those children are going to be LGBT, and that they need to be educated so that they don't feel awkward or weird, right? And that to every ear sounds like a reasonable argument in modern times, doesn't it? So how do we address? This is the thing, we've got. It's quite subtle. The agenda is quite subtle, and we've got to understand the argument, and we've got to be able to tackle it. So we've got to know, what the direction of attack is going to be. And would you agree that that's sort of quite a good argument why we should be teaching these things? But obviously the answer to it is that we don't sexualize our children, and that we don't have to say, this kind of behaviour is okay and this kind of behaviour is okay, because what we do is we say, you are loved, you are cherished, you've got infinite dignity as a human person, and we don't talk about sexuality to your children because that's inappropriate.
I'm glad you raised that,
would
Mark,
you say something else?
No, I'm glad you raised that. I was listening to an LBC program the other day with James O'Brien, whom I don't like at all. And a lady phoned in talking about sex education, and she said that her son, who was about 11, had been hit on by an older gay boy who was inviting him to do certain acts, and he didn't understand the language. And so he didn't run a mile because he just was bemused. And then they had a sex education lesson, and he discovered what the language meant, and he freaked out and went to his mum, and his mum said, well, you probably don't want to be groomed by this older gay boy. So thank goodness that they introduced the kind of raw, gritty facts of life to you about what people do with penises, and giving it the sort of the language of the street to it, or you wouldn't have known. And I thought to myself, okay, so this is really quite a good argument at face value, because in one sense what it's doing is saying sexual predatoriness has got right down into the prepubescent area, and these people are saying, well, we need information to defend ourselves from it. But of course, that's assuming that you've allowed that to happen without pushing back. I think the Catholic position would be, well, but by teaching children about sexuality in the appropriate way at the appropriate time, what you would be doing is creating an atmosphere where it became much more difficult for that kind of predatory hedonism to permeate everywhere without restraint, because there was no sense of rebuking the predator. It was always just, how do I keep my son safe from them? But there is a case for rebuking the predator. There is a case for saying predatory sexual behavior for children under 16 is immoral, and Catholics think so and are willing to say so. So essentially, if you follow Catholic teaching, you produce a society where teaching children to evade predators isn't necessary because you've given them a safe environment.
Yeah.
But Mark's quite right. The arguments used are very attractive ones, and what we have to do is to examine the presuppositions they're built upon, because they're usually problematic.
I think I don't go along with this idea of going to the lowest common denominator, because that's where we are and that's where we have to meet them. I think we have to offer them something higher and elevate them. And besides, one of the arguments for sex education in schools was because they were worried about the teenage pregnancy rate, because they were worried about sexually transmitted infections. And since they've introduced it, both of those have skyrocketed. Abortions have skyrocketed. We don't say, well, one day my child might be approached by a cannibal, so I'm going to show them a horror movie about being eaten alive to prepare them for that. or well, someone might, but I'd say they're quite depraved if they do. And so we know that there's evil in the world, and we know that there's suffering. We know that we live in this world. But I think the best thing we can do to guard against it is to strengthen them in their faith, and to say this exists, and look how awful it is that it's causing damage and depression and suicide and slavery, and people are enslaved to these ideas. Not to say, well, gay pride next week, men in leather butt chaps. Let's show a little bit to our 10-year-olds so that they're prepared for it when they get on the train in the morning. I just don't agree. I just don't think that's the right answer. And it does annoy me that I think our schools sometimes take the view, well, it's in our. I've heard teachers and head teachers and leaders say, well, what can you do? It's in the culture. We've got to deal with it. Well, deal with it in the way that you know is best, which is through our faith, through the lens of our faith, and through the dignity of the human person. Whether you happen to have experience same-sex attraction, or have neurodivergency, or any other difficulty or thing that might be a problem as you get older, the main thing is you need to know that you are loved, that you are precious, that you've been created by love, for love. And I think planting some of these ideas in our children's heads gives them a different message. It gives them a different message that says you're used, you will be used, and here's how you can protect yourself against use. And it's not a message of love.
And it's
So
admitting that this is inevitable in some way. And
yeah,
I think, like, the cannibalism analogy is probably a poor one, because there's something unique about sexuality and sexualization. There's something about it, about our fallen nature and the way we react to those sort of ideas. And it leads, exactly as you say, to slavery and just deeper pain. And the Catholic way is so much better. So what's going on? Do our education leaders lack intellect? Do our bishops lack the intellect to be able to engage properly with these arguments? Or do they lack the faith? Do they not believe that these are better arguments? There's some real major disconnect going on here, to the point where we're not talking about it. We're not. And even, like one priest I was talking to this week, as was sort of told that he mustn't talk about these things in his homilies or in his, and I just think it's appalling, because who is talking about it? No one is talking about it, and you can see the result. The result is Catholic schools going along with the moral decay that we see surrounding ourselves, and kids don't understand why they should be Catholic, why they should get married, why they should have children, why these things are good things and not, what the secular world tells them they are. So
they do know that they shouldn't use single-use plastic bottles. They do,
well,
but they
that's
do
what's
know
important,
that
obviously. Yeah.
Yes.
God for that, because everything will be all right, because we're not going to use straws anymore. So
yeah, tick. There we go. Well
done, Bishop.
Mark, yes. No more plastic straws. What a win.
Yeah.
I think it's probably a combination of many of those things you've said. I think at the root of it is a lack of faith. I think it's either a lack of faith in those answers, or, well, it must be a lack of faith, and therefore a lack of belief that they're the right things to turn to. Also laziness. Well, it's just easy, isn't it? For goodness sake, do we really want this battle? Can't be bothered. Go along with it. Someone else will sort it out. And it's all very sad. But there we are. Gavin.
I just wanted to throw in 2 points. First of all, I like the cannibal analogy, because it made me sit up and think and shocked me. So I thought it was very helpful. I also think it shows. I think the one thing we need to do is to think about sex differently, but we're always on the defensive as Catholics. Catholics are always seen to be people who are making rules and saying no. But actually, one of the ways of changing this, particularly for children, is to talk about sex as a gift rather than from an instrument simply for pleasure. And once again, it's the presuppositions that are wrong. The presuppositions are that we're a pleasure-seeking society where people are trying to enjoy themselves without restrictions. And I think we have to start further back along the chain of thought to reconfigure the presuppositions and at least give children not just different sexual and moral teaching, but different presuppositions, that we're not here simply as pleasure-seeking machines to enjoy ourselves and to use whatever comes to hand, whether it's food or drugs or sexuality. And that actually to remind people that the way in which we use sex has a profound impact on our sense of well-being, on our psychology, on our being abused or not abused. people are so concerned about the notion of mental health and about becoming a victim or being abused, but actually mishandling sexuality is one of the quickest routes to feeling abused, to feeling of no particular value, to having the way in which our minds and bodies and souls work disconnected. And I think one of the things as Catholics we failed, and as Christians we failed to do, is to give people a positive view of what can be achieved if we live with right ethics, rather than being put on the back foot and being put into a corner and told that we're the no people. On the contrary, we're the yes people. We're people who have a vision for rebuilding both human beings and society. And sex happens to be a very powerful piece of instrumentation.
Yeah, exactly. It's a no to something for a greater yes, isn't it? That's the thing. It's a yes to something that's far more fulfilling and far more significant and far more aligned to our created being than mere pleasure. And that's what we have to get across. Excellent. Well, I mentioned the cannibal example because I happen to know a friend who decided to show her children horror films from the time they were young and said, well, this is good for them, it'll toughen them up. And they're weird. It's weird kids. They're weird because it influences them. It's not toughening them up for the big bad world. It helps to form the big bad world with weirdos. And of course we know that awful case of the Bulger. The boys who killed Jamie Bulger had watched depraved films and then tried to reenact them. So we can't pretend that what we feed to our children when they're young and vulnerable doesn't cause the thing that we're saying will help guard against it. This will help to guard against that. So if we sexualize them when they're young, guess what? They're going to grow up and think that sex is merely for pleasure and not much more. Right, I know we've got to go and end it there, but thank you so much for watching. Do please visit the website catholicunscripted.com. I'm Catherine Bennett.
I'm Mark Lambert.
I'm Gavin Ashenden.